So this directly follows the talk from last week, and I'm not sure how much of an overlap that will be uh, for you folks, but I'm going to start from that perspective, which is also a perspective that shaped the work that I presented September 24th when I talked about um, cosmopolitics and post-human philosophy of art, um, where I talked about the cultural work of the distinction between reversible and irreversible time and the cultivation of the concept of emergence and avant-garde art. And then I suggest that this is also true of minitarian art, particularly with reference to jazz and what we might call critical race theory. So in that context, I'm now going to talk about emergence, which was mostly focused on the irreversibility of time, the contingency of time, and the phenomenon of bifurcation as one of the symptoms of emergent systems or self-organizing systems, which was the basis of the talk last week, which I shared the stage with Eric Sissoff, a wonderful Pittsburgh guitarist with a national reputation, who demonstrated for me, in part because I'm really not able to play these days. So he was very nice to step in on my behalf for that. So on that note, I'm going to start with the screen share and basically talk off these slides in order to one, make sure that you don't have to stare at my ugly mug for the whole time, but also be able to take notes. And I hope that helps. So why don't I start that now? Okay, so if everybody's ready, I'll just go ahead and start. So this week, I'm still talking about reversible and irreversible time and emergence. But now, instead of talking about the extrinsic manifestations of emergence, which are actually visible even in music notation with respect to jazz, now I'm talking about the intrinsic manifestations of emergence with respect to the cognitive neuroscience of jazz improvisation. So on that note, I'll start. So I'm going to talk about definitions of projective apprehension and propriosentience, which are neologisms that I invented to help talk about distinctions in cognitive styles going on during improvisation and during practice for improvisation, and the concept of emergence. And I'll also talk about Francisco Varela's 3 forms of time cognition and Daniel Kahneman's distinction between thinking fast and thinking slow, thinking fast and thinking slow. Then I will resituate these discussions in terms of theories about top-down and bottom-up cognitive processes in embodied cognition, and to notice the distinction between top-down executive function and bottom-up neuronal ensemble behavior. And then I'll talk about Francisco Varela's 3 hypotheses on neuronal ensembles, and then Evan Thompson's theories about cognition, about ground states of cognition in his book, Waking, Dreaming, and Being. Then I'll refer to the extended mind thesis with reference to the philosophy of mind, and here I will wax poetically in a brief way in order to hide my massive ignorance in these matters, and hopefully David can step in and save me if I run into problems. From affordances and resonances and prosthetics to structural couplings and resistance with respect to the agency of instruments, And then I'll talk about feedback loops from within brains to between performer and instrument to then performers in the ensemble. And finally, to talk about the movement from embodied cognition to distributed cognition, and to suggest that jazz ensembles behave like neuronal ensembles. So, first of all, a review of the 5 principles of emergence, one of which is a kind of hobby horse of mine that I'm introducing to this, and I'll show you in the middle. The irreversibility of duration, and this comes out of my discussions of micropolitics and post-human philosophy, but also with reference to the distinction between classical music and jazz. Classical music exemplifying time reversible systems, jazz exemplifying time irreversible systems. Then I'll talk about the contingency of complex systems. In other words, the collapse of the deterministic model and system as a field of all possibilities. And then immanence of the implicate field, which is, might say, my own private contribution to this, where we move from individual embodied flow to the pervasive distributed ensembles groove. So you might want to talk that as a kind of a functional immanence of the implicated sonic field. So then and I have been talking about bifurcation and the unfolding of possible futures in 4 different dimensions: melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and then percussive rhythm, which was the basis of my conversation last week. And then finally, this week, I'll be emphasizing the role of feedback loops performing differences and repetitions within the system or the song form, within the individual embodied performer, between the performer and the instrument, and amongst the embodied performers in the distributed ensemble. So I developed my own vocabulary for talking about the difference between styles of cognition that occur during practice versus the styles of cognition dominant or hopefully dominant during actual performance in real time on the bandstand. I've got to figure out how to close this. That helps a little bit. So, one term is called projective apprehension, and the other term is called propriosentience. So during projective apprehension, which dominates during practice, musicians visualize melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic patterns on the instrument. Then they internalize these pathways through embodied practice until these pathways become visual schema embodied in memory and accessible even when eyes are closed on the instruments that they're performing. And then through constant practice, they capture these pathways in proprioception, which is why I call it projective apprehension. So the process is to identify patterns, to visualize them, and then to internalize them through practice until they become schema that are visible even with eyes closed, and then capture them in proprioception. This provides a template for intention superimposed on the musical moment. This is what is results from practice in the practice room. But during propriosentience, musicians surrender higher order cognitive processes in order to allow for emergent embodied responses to the sounds created by the other players. Furthermore, the sound from the other musicians creates immediate reactive motor activity, which are related to the capture of the pathways implied by that sound during projective apprehension. In other words, the fixing of the proprioceptive activity, which captures those pathways in sound with respect to melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and percussive rhythm. The sounds that musicians hear in the midst of performance can actually trigger motor memory and enable instinctual response to what is being heard. Oh, it's not moving. I got to do this now. Okay. So with projective apprehension, we talk about schema theory and David Sudnow's pathways. And I talked about this last week. And those pathways are, for example, chord progressions, chord scale relationships, pentatonic scales, the relationships between scales and chords, the relationship between tonal centers and chords, where tonal centers can become actually bifurcating pathways towards distinct and juxtaposed harmonic centers, and therefore exploring bifurcation in 4 dimensions of melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and percussive rhythm during practice. And this corresponds to what has been attributed to both Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, which is to learn everything you can about music and then forget everything and just play. So that is the reservoir of embodied knowledge, not just intellectual knowledge, not just the ability to identify sound, but the fact that it's embodied in proprioceptive memory. Then propriosentience is something different. So proprioception is beyond muscle memory. It includes sinews, ligaments, bones, nerve pathways. It's really the entire motor of functions of the body that actually have corresponding sections of the brain devoted to it. And this also involves not just thinking in jazz, as the book by Berlin says, which is a wonderful book about how these pathways get developed by practicing jazz musicians, to the interactivity amongst the musicians exemplified by the work by Ingrid Monson called Saying Something. So this corresponds to the deeper level of improvisational ability, which is captured by the expression that Sonny Rollins said in a video that is available on YouTube in the mid-2010s, where he says, "Don't play the music, man, let the music play you." And what he means by that is it becomes a reactive form of musical intelligence that's triggered proprioceptively by the sounds emanating from the other players. So then what we're doing is, from last week, we talked about the extrinsic manifestations of emergence, exemplified by bifurcation in those 4 dimensions of melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and percussive rhythm. But now what we want to do is to talk about the black box of how bifurcation happens. In other words, what does in the moment, which is a term that Gary Peters uses, drawn from phenomenology of both Husserl and Heidegger, what does that really mean? And so we can refer to, I can't pronounce his name, it's Csikszentmihalyi, and also the theorist Luc Nin from Belgium, the term flow. And then Kobeson and Bargo talk about the field of improvisation. Mark Doffman talks about groove, and Sherdorf talks about collective intelligence. So this is a pretty good kind of anticipation of what I'm going to be talking about today. Let me go back down here. Okay. So now let's talk about projective apprehensions as pathways, memory, and practice. So the first step in those 4 dimensions has to do with melodic resources, as resources for discovering forks in the road. And here I mentioned 6 of who I think are the most important educators as well as performers in the history of jazz that really constitutes the pre academic So I'm talking about 6 major educators that really go from the pre-academic um, realm of jazz pedagogy to into pedagogy that was deployed in academic sources, famously at North Texas State, Berklee College of Music, New England Conservatory, and so forth. So Dennis Sandoli, who was an educator in Philadelphia, took Slonimsky's Encyclopedia of Scale Formations and broke down these octave scales into quatrains, and then developed a system for mixing and matching these in order to create entirely new kinds of scales. And because of the fact that you can build chords off of each note in a scale, a whole different approach to harmonic structure. And Sandoli's famous for educating, oh God, John Coltrane, the Heath brothers, um, Jim Hall, I'm blanking. Sorry, I have cognitive difficulties sometimes these days. Um, uh, Art Farmer, the flugelhorn player, Pat Martino, the guitarist, as well as Jim Hall, the guitarist. And there's many, many others that I could be mentioned. And so that was one major contribution that Dennis Sandoli made. George Russell, who ended up, who was a composer and performer, a really important performer, who developed a whole new way of developing scale and harmonic structures based on the Lydian scale, which, if you remember from last week, the Lydian scale is a major sounding scale, but with a half step between the 4th and 5th degrees of a scale rather than the 3rd and 4th of the major scale. And the reason why he mentions the Lydian scale is because within it, the 5/7 flat 5 chord, which is a crucial chord in jazz, becomes central rather than marginal to the system of harmony and melody. Whereas Lenny Tristano developed a method of instruction where he would emphasize the capacity of his students to visualize imaginatively songs and their melodic and harmonic resources in their minds without recourse to instruments, so that they would sing melodies, they would memorize and transcribe the melodies or the solos of others, memorize them, sing them, and bring that same approach to their own performance, which includes developing in the practice room multiple kinds of approaches to generating melody over the course of a jazz standard, for example. Charlie Benakis, a really important educator located in Boston. Lenny Tristano was actually in Long Island and New York City. Charlie Benakis was in Boston. Charlie Benakis developed a system of education where he would have each student, and this is just one of the things that he would do, he would have each student learn a jazz standard. And then he would have them learn that song in every key, and to come up with a myriad approach to harmonizing the song and reharmonizing, reconceiving of the harmonic progression that the song that captures the melody of that song, and to notice the ambiguity given the fact that there are multiple ways of harmonizing a particular melodic sequence. And then we have those students learn them. And then he would have the students write out separate, distinct solos for each song that the student would learn. and learn them in every single key. So it'd have the student explore all the harmonic resources of the song in every key, and then explore all the melodic resources with respect to forks in the road in terms of possible melodic resources for improvising over the song. And so that means that if you have 7 separate solos written out for each key, that means 49 separate solos. And the point isn't really to memorize 49 solos in order to execute them on the bandstand individually, but it means that given the contingency of the moment, the soloist can draw from 49 separate pathways, and in which at any time in the process of those pathways, bifurcations could occur to jump from one version of a solo to another, which in turn would lead to the flexibility to generate novel melodic sequences that were not initially derived from the 49 exercises or etudes they would have them do. If you think about the amount of work, the fact that he would have students study with him for years, and they would only do one song at a time from one lesson, and sometimes spend multiple lessons on a single song. You can see how in-depth those pathways became for individual performers. And for example, the avant-garde free jazz pianist, Marilyn Crispell, who has had her own career for years, but was, for example, in Anthony Braxton's band for 10 years. She went through all of this after going through studying with Charlie Mariano at Berkeley, and before that being both a new music and early modernist performer of classical music, trained in a double major in New England Conservatory. She happened to hear A Love Supreme by Coltrane, changed her life, and then she shifted from classical performance into jazz performance and composition, and became a free jazz performer. But she is a free jazz performer, having gone through all these developments of all these different pathways at the level of melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and percussive rhythm. Dave Liebman developed a method for moving in and out of the tonality of a song from one chord to the next through the implication of the use of chromaticisms, which are accidentals or half-step notes approaching and moving away from the tonal notes of the given song melody, or even hello? Should I continue?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So that's what Dave Liebman contributed, and he was already teaching at universities, but I mean, these are all private instructors, and people would study for years with these people before they were really ready to hit the bandstand. And the final example is Jerry Bergozzi, who developed a system for floating pentatonics. Now, we have an exemplification of the movement from bifurcation to aggregation with A Love Supreme, where McCoy Tyner would be cycling through tonal centers using voicings and fourths, while Coltrane would be cycling through pentatonic scales with different tonal centers, and they would be completely independent of each other. But because it was so easy to hear both voicings and fourths, because of their ambiguous harmony, the fact that voicings and fourths can imply multiple tonal centers at the same time, and pentatonics are so easy to follow in terms of the narrative flow of the melodic line, that moving from one pentatonic and one tonal center to another, the listener was still able to follow because it was so easy to hear these pentatonic scales. So that's melodic resources. Harmonic resources, for example, polytonality. I talked about a lot of this last week, but in review, the tritone substitutions where, for example, the 5/7 of a chord scale of a tonic note like C major 7, which would be G7, has the same a tritone dissonance as the flat 2/7 chord, which is D flat 7. And so those two chords became interchangeable in jazz harmony. So if someone saw the 5/7, they could just play the flat 2/7 because what it would introduce were the extended, altered harmonic dissonances that were available. And the same thing went with melody. For example, if someone played a 5/7 chord, such as G7, somebody could play the D melodic minor scale from the 7th degree, which would be the locally in melodic minor, and that would still sound good. And the reverse is true. One could play just a straight G Mixolydian scale, which is the C major scale beginning with the note G or the 5th degree of the scale, and play that G scale against the D flat score chord, which would emphasize the dissonant tones available as extensions of the standard harmony. And that's how you start to move into polytonality, where you're implying other harmonic tonalities while playing within another. From there, we get to Bill Evans and the development of upper structure triads, where you play, for example, an E triad against a D triad, which would be a D major 7 sharp 11 chord, or a Lydian chord, a D major 7 Lydian chord. And there are many other kinds of upper structure triads which are less consonant sounding than the E over D chord, the E major triad over the D major triad. And these also imply multiple tonalities at the same time. I've already talked a little bit about voicings and fourths, exemplified by the work of McCoy-Tyner. And then we have modal reharmonizations, where any mode from any chord from that mode can represent the mode. And that also extends in polytonal ways the resources available of a tonal center implied by a pedal note. So really any note in any context becomes available to the improviser. And then I also talked about last week blues variations, the fact that the harmonic rhythms of a 12-bar blues became messed with by jazz musicians who would interpolate, for example, between the first and the fourth bars of a measure, a whole range of possible alternative harmonic progressions, even to the point of introducing Coltrane changes into the standard 12-bar blues, where the blues remains recognizable because in all of these versions of the blues, the 5th bar of the 12-bar blues always lands on the 4/7 chord, which would be F7 in a C blues, C7 to F7 to G7 chord. And then it became part of the process by which jazz songs became developed through increasingly sophisticated versions of songs, which would occur through time by people soloing over songs, tape recording and then transcribing the solos, and then looking at the implied harmonies that were accomplished in the generation of those solos, and then rewrite songs so that How High the Moon, the standard, would become Charlie Parker's Ornithology, and these songs would go through 4, 5, 6 or more iterations to the point where then past the bebop era, we had someone like Miles Davis actually begin composing songs where there were multiple harmonic rhythms coexisting simultaneously, and the soloists could decide which or to alternate between the different harmonic rhythms. And last week I talked about the song It's About That Time from the album In a Silent Way from 1968, I think it was. So then we have the development over time, exemplified by the Pittsburgh tradition of bebop jazz drumming, and then the introduction of third world contributions. Pittsburgh, Kenny Clark, Art Blakey, Roger Humphreys, who still is dean of the jazz community here, Jeff Tane Watts, and a whole number of other Joe. I'm trying to remember Joe's last name. He also played with Charlie Parker back in the day. It's an amazing this Pittsburgh dynasty of jazz drumming introduced polytonal structures in percussive rhythms, and this becomes added to by, for example, Dizzy Gillespie's embrace, among other people like Mongo Santa Maria of Afro-Cuban rhythms, and then the introduction of Brazilian rhythms, then the incredibly complex rhythms from India, Iran, Turkey, Morocco, and so forth. So that's an example of the resources in terms of projective apprehension that provide pathways in these four dimensions of melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and percussive rhythm. Now, propriosentience. Enacted memory is contingent reactive cognition. So what we're talking about is the contingent flexibility of proprioceptive awareness. We've talked about how all these pathways and all these dimensions are developed in the practice room. And now what we're talking about is the contingency of the performative moment on the bandstand in real time. And so what I'm suggesting is that there's an association that occurs in the practice room of sound and proprioception as a form of situational awareness. So proprioceptive memory and the memory of sound on the instrument become intertwined. And so then the question is, can a specific sound trigger a specific remembered motor action? Can unexpected sounds in real time trigger unpracticed movements on the instrument? This is what I suggest what happens during improvisation in drawing on all the resources in melody, harmony, harmonic rhythm, and percussive rhythm, but also how in this reactive mode of cognition, which I call propriosentience, that unexpected sounds in real time can trigger unpracticed movements on the instrument. This is how novel resources emerge spontaneously as part of the creative process. So in terms of theories of interactivity, if you remember, that is referenced to the difference between thinking in jazz and saying something, thinking in jazz by Berlin and saying something by, I've got to find, I'm blanking on her name again. Ingrid Monson. Intentionality becomes a real problem when one stops listening. And I'm going to be explaining this a little further when we come into the problem of cognitive dissonance during improvisation. But I'm also suggesting that one cannot engage in the contingent reactivity of propriosentience unless one is able to surrender intentionality. In other words, many novice players, such as myself, would go and practice, for example, multiple pathways for improvising over the tune, A Blues for Alice, which is an altered a 12-bar blues by Charlie Parker, which has all these interpolated 2-5-1 progressions in whole steps in the first part of the song and then half steps in the second part of the song, of descending whole steps and descending half steps between the 1 chord, the 5 chord, and the 4 chord in that 5th measure, if you remember me talking about that. But in practicing for the song, I'd be practicing all these melodic pathways. And then when I'd get on the bandstand and play with the other performers, I would be so intent on playing what I'd been practicing that I'd become overshadowed. My intention would overshadow what the other musicians were doing. And for example, there'd be nothing stopping the rhythm section from suddenly adopting a different version of a 12-bar blues while I was trying to solo over the chord changes for blues for Alice. And I would find myself in a different place from the rest of the ensemble and sometimes not even realize it for 4 or 6 bars until suddenly the dissonance of the sound of me not being in the right place at the right time made my continued performing absurd and forced me to the position where I would have to stop and listen. So by surrendering intentionality, it allows the ensemble to speak, to tell a story collectively. Now, I'm basing all this on the essay that I suggested for reading for this week, which is Jazz as Narrative, Narrating Cognitive Processes Involved in Jazz Improvisation. And I go into all of this in some detail in that essay, but I'm going to extend beyond what I cover in that essay just in order to create context. So this is how we get from I've got to get my mind out of the way, which is something that the bassist in Pittsburgh, Paul Thompson, said about the problem of performing when you have so much stuff going on in your mind, to let the music play you. In other words, by surrendering intentionality, it allows the ensemble to speak to you and you respond. And in the act of responding, it's possible to generate novel melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, and percussive rhythmic content. So now let's talk more specifically about cognition. So the famous book by Daniel Levitin from 2006 called "This Is Your Brain on Music" sums up what had been discovered so far in terms of cognition of music, and particularly in terms of brain function. So particular attributes of musical cognition can be correlated with local brain function. Performing musicians showed decisive expansion of certain brain functioning associated with performance competence. So there's a difference already between people listening to music and people performing music. These competencies involve centers of emotion, fine and large motor skills, as well as sites associated with language, conceptual behavior, and spatial cognition. As opposed to non-musicians, more widespread neurosynchrony takes place across all spectrums of the brain, from the reptilian limbic to the prefrontal and frontal cortex. In other words, we're now moving already, even in 2006, from describing local brain function to global brain functioning with respect to neurosynchrony. And one conclusion that Daniel Levitin has is that the greater the musical competence, the more pervasive, simultaneous, and integrated neural network behavior is associated with cognition, feeling, and motor action. So now I want to place this in context with philosophy of mind. And here I'm just going to summarize and hopefully not get in trouble by trying to hide my vast ignorance in this subject, as David will will no doubt be able to demonstrate, I hope, in our conversation afterwards. So there are 4 basic theories of the extended mind. The expanded self refers to networks of subjectivity that exist at the level of symbolic exchange, family, society, and so forth. This corresponds in music to the shared template of the song form and the discourse of jazz. The extended mind refers to how the body melds with the world through affordances. And there have been a number of models proposed and different models for different acts involving body and the world. This corresponds to the coupling of the body instrument. Self is multitude, and this is what mostly I'll be talking to from now on. The self is multitude model refers to how each entity within the multiplicity of human cognition engages the world on its own terms, which creates an internal, perhaps cacophonous dialogue. This corresponds to the distinct forms of time cognition identified theoretically by Francisco Varela and empirically through the cognitive neuroscience of people like Charles Limb, to demonstrate that we are a multiplicity when we're improvising. And the more we relinquish control in the form of executive function, the more successful we will be as improvisers. So how can that happen? And then actor network theory refers to how cognition is inexorably bound up with objects which become non-living entities with agency within the cognitive processes, which then extend into the environment. Here's where the question of the non-human agency of instruments in the shaping of proprioceptive awareness extends as well to how individual musicians playing their respective instruments begin to coordinate into a functioning ensemble, how that comes into play. So, for example, we have the actor network theory of the agency of the instrument. And if you think about how different the proprioceptive pathways would be for a vibes player, which is basically playing on an instrument that looks kind of like a piano, but which involves much larger motor activity than a piano, which has large motor activity, but also involves the small motor activity of the individual fingers. But then think about the difference between a trombonist and a drummer, or a trumpeter and a tuba player, or a guitarist and a violinist. The fact they're all speaking the same language, as I talked about in terms of the expanded self, and the fact that they share the template of the song and the discourse of jazz, but imagine how those proprioceptive pathways are foundationally different, and yet they're still able to communicate with each other. So we can see that the work that we will summarize below on the distinct and often competing cognitive processes at different timescales corresponds in part to the self as multitude, but we can also see how these other theories of extended mind come into play. So prosthesis to structural coupling, and from actor network to assemblage. Body-instrument relations. Prosthesis refers to the smooth extension of the mind from body to object, such as an artificial limb, or a data glove with VR goggles, or Ripley with her cargo hold exoskeleton. Here we can see that the assemblage of the non-human object becomes an extension of the movements, the proprioceptive movements of the performer. But structural coupling, and I'm suggesting that this really doesn't work for music, because structural coupling is a far more complex account of functional links between the human and non-human, involving both resonance and resistance in the interactivity between an instrument. And here's where we can conceive of non-human instruments having agency. On the one hand, language of music functions as constant no matter what instrument is played. Yet instruments have agency in shaping the proprioceptive pathways in startlingly different instruments. But now let's talk about resistance. On a guitar, when I'm performing with a pick and my fingers holding the string against the fretboard, I get resistance from both the string and the tension of the string, but also in the function of the frets on the fingerboard. And with the pick, we get resistance from the individual string as well as the strings from being plucked, given their tension. The same thing with a piano, and people buy pianos based on how the particular performer feels about the resistance that the individual keys on the instrument provide to the fingers. And they actually examine each and every instrument that they think about purchasing in terms of their comfort level. And then they develop different levels of functioning. And that's also true for guitars. And if you think, for example, the difference between rock musicians, for example, solid body guitars with very thin strings, and the kind of guitar that I play, for example, I play an arch top guitar when I do play, with a 0.13 on the top string in terms of the density of the string and the tension. And my friend Eric will sometimes play 0.16 density of string with massive, comparatively massive resistance, just because he's reached the level of chops or technique where he knows how to finesse that relationship without working hard at all. So now we can think about this structural coupling in terms of actor network theories, from Bruno Latour to Peter Gallison to the cognitive scientist Edwin Hutchins, and how they bring top-down and bottom-up critiques of human, digital, and institutional cognitive systems to assemblage theory, for example, Deleuze and Guattari and Manuel de Landa, to object-oriented philosophy such as Graham Harman, and for example, Deleuze and Guattari scholars such as Nick Nesbitt and Phil Turetsky have made analogical connections between jazz and assemblage theory, but without accounting for, as I will going forward, the body-instrument relationship and the cognitive science of neuronal ensemble behavior. So body-instrument relationships, ergonomics as resonance and resistance, the agency of instruments. So to sum up, instruments have agency in shaping the proprioceptive pathways of the human bodies that play them: body, arms, hands, fingers, embouchure, impinging on the performers from the skin to the motor regions of the brain. And by the skin, I also mean the embouchure of the lips. A pianist versus vibraphonist, string bassist versus guitarist, oboist versus contrabassoonist, drummer versus conga player. Somebody playing more than one instrument will have separate proprioceptive pathways, even though the language is the same. For example, just as a joke and as a lark, I photographed my friend, the bassist and a producer who produced 3 of Richie Cole's final albums before he passed away. I had him perform Blues for Alice simultaneously, not simultaneous, but separately on the string bass and on the trombone, on which he's equally adept. And so I photographed him in still photography with him placing the note on each instrument in order. And I think there were like 117 notes in Blues for Alice. And so I did 117 still pictures of Mark Perner on the string bass and Mark Perner on the trombone. And what you see is just, you can just imagine the proprioceptive difference in the pathways that enable Mark to move from one to the other. But of course, this was a joke, because the only way that this makes sense as proprioceptive behavior is if you keep it in real time. And it's the flow from one note to the next that is accomplished by proprioceptive action that is the important point here. But I did that as a joke, and I could show that to you sometime. I actually have them in a PowerPoint presentation that I did for somebody else at some point. But I also like to point that the relationship between the living and the non-living is also reversible. And I want to point out to the case of Gary Burton, the famous jazz vibist, who I got to study small band arranging with at Berkeley, just one class as an undergraduate, underclassman, as a sophomore. So Gary Burton started out as a pianist, and then decided over time that he just fell in love with the vibes, the vibraphone, and switched over from the small motor skills of the piano to the large motor skills involved in the vibraphone. But having the experience of playing the piano, he brought from the piano to the vibes the instrumental technique and introduced the formality technique, which enabled him to engage harmonically with the instrument in a way much closer to a piano than had been realized in real time during jazz performance by other jazz vibraphonists. Transformed the instrument. You know, the instrument was never the same after Gary Burton introduced pianistic technique to the vibraphone. So is the relationship one of extension? And here Luc Niche is someone, a really wonderful theorist, who talks about the instrument as a natural extension of the body. And here I would disagree in dealing with natural and artificial prostheses, that it's much closer because of this issue of not only resonance, but resistance in terms of the artificial coupling as a model for body-instrument relations. So now let's talk about the neuroscientific of emergence, from cognitive neuroscience to theoretical cognitive science. So there was a famous study in 2008 which transformed the education, I mean, not the education, but the research that was being done on music and the brain, particularly because it was able to focus on jazz in real time. And the way that Lim Brown did this in this landmark study was that he built, he's a neuroscientist and also a jazz pianist who still runs a team at Johns Hopkins University, and they've been generating many studies after this. But this is really important because it really began a paradigm shift in the way that the cognitive neuroscience of jazz was studied. So Lim Brown built a piano with a keyboard without any metal parts because he could then place the keyboard inside an fMRI. And then he took both jazz and classical pianists, put them inside the fMRI, and then had them play alternatively a sequence of learned and remembered written music in the form of a classical composition, and then to perform in response to a music -1 configuration, a recording of a jazz standard, with the space, the oral space normally associated with the soloist left blank, which is a practice device. A practice device for jazz musicians educating themselves. So what he discovered was stark and drastic. What he discovered was that as opposed to classical musicians whose executive function and the visual cortex, which are highly lit up during their performance of these classical pieces, those areas of the brain were asleep during in the jazz musicians. Whereas in the jazz musicians, while the visual cortex was asleep and the executive function areas of the brain were asleep, what emerged were these global emergent ensembles, neuronal ensembles. And he actually talks about executive function and the visual cortex being associated with top-down cognition, while associating the bottom-up emergence of neuronal ensembles. And he postulated that the emergence of these neuronal ensembles, which involve global brain behavior, can be associated with artistic creativity, generally speaking. And so here I suggest that we need to move theoretically to the work of Francisco Varela on cognitive architecture, specifically in terms of top-down and bottom-up architecture, exemplified by his groundbreaking paradigm-forming book, The Embodied Mind, Human Cognitive Science and Human Experience. And I want to exemplify this with reference to two other people, Arco and Gins in avant-garde architecture and Edward Hutchins in anthropology, who also refer specifically to this distinction between top-down and bottom-up cognition. So, in other words, what I would like to indulge in right now is an entry into what I call the black box of cognition, and what Francisco Varela calls the specious present. And I'm suggesting that Varela's distinction between competing time flows at the 10 scale, the 1/10 scale, and the 1 scale, which correspond roughly to what Daniel Kahneman calls fast thinking and slow thinking, help to explain, for example, how human beings function cognitively as a multiplicity, and can also explain, for example, the problem that I had as a novice trying to play Blues for Alice, that I would get lost in the middle of my improvisation. And this also would enable us to understand, for example, how free jazz becomes a special case of the model that I'm proposing, which involves completely surrendering the 10 scale, involving no narrative frame shared by members of the ensemble. Okay. So let's talk about Varela's 3 forms of time cognition and Kahneman's thinking fast and slow. So Kahneman says, Varela talks about these 3 forms of time cognition as coexisting. That these exist simultaneously, and that there's wide bandwidth to our embodied cognition. So he talks about the 1/10 scale, or what the more accessible Daniel Kahneman calls thinking fast, which involves immediate apprehension of sensory data. While the 10 scale, or what Kahneman calls thinking slow, which enables the subject to self-consciously contextualize immediate experience in a larger narrative frame. The 1 scale, which we might consider as a default form of pervasive awareness that seeks to coordinate or balance these contending forms of time cognition, the 1/10 scale and the 10 scale, for optimal performance. The 10 scale predominates during practice, and the 1/10 scale should predominate, and does for experienced musicians, during interactive performance. But they do exist and coexist simultaneously. Now, someone before me, Vijay Iyer, the famous Indian-American jazz and world music pianist, and a professor of music and cognitive science at Johns Hopkins, talks about these three timescales, and he associates them with bodily activities and Varilla's three timescales. So, and I don't find this particularly successful. I think that one can make a loose association here, but I'm not sure how much explanatory power it has. And I would suggest that we need to reconceive of these timescales in terms of top-down and bottom-up cognitive architecture. And I refer to R.R. Kins's landing sites in their work, The Architectural Body. For example, they talk about a body moving through an architectural field, which they call an architectural surround. And they talk about three kinds of landing sites. They talk about the perceptual landing site, the imaging landing site, and the coordinating landing site. So the perceptual landing site is the immediate data of moving through the landscape from one moment to the next. The imaging landing site are templates or schema of the mind registering past experiences in the form of memory. So it is remembering past movements through the pathways of the architectural surround. And what they call the coordinating landing site, that's where these two have to become organized and balanced. And I illustrated this in an essay from 2003. Where I talk about my experience walking on an alumni weekend to the student union of my alma mater, and talking intensely with a friend I hadn't seen in 4 or 5 years. And we were engrossed in conversation as we walked this pathway, which we had done hundreds of times while a student. And I was so engrossed in my conversation with my friend that I ended up ramming my nose into a portal that had been constructed since the last time I had been then, which had been used to create a dead airspace to save heat in the student union, and which of course generated laughter in my friend, and which spread to all my friends, and which was a source of much amusement for my friends for decades afterwards. And so what I'm suggesting is that I was so engrossed in my conversation with my friend that I had effaced the imaging landing site completely. I had effaced, the perceptual landing site so completely that I had stopped paying attention to where I was, and I was relying completely on the imaging landing site, which was based in the memory of past walking on the same pathway. So what I'm suggesting is that something goes on very similarly to when jazz musicians improvise. So now I want to put this in a larger context in terms of the distinction between top-down and bottom-up cognition, which is laid out really carefully in that paradigm-breaking embodied mind by Francisco Varela. So how do we talk about the difference between the top-down computational versus the bottom-up emergent paradigms of cognitive science? So this is from the embodied mind. So computational paradigm. 1, what is cognition? Answer: information processing as symbolic computation, rule-based manipulation of symbols. Question number 2, how does it work? Answer: through any device that can support and manipulate discrete functional elements, the symbols. The system interacts only with the form of the symbols, their physical attributes, not their meaning. Question number 3, how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? Answer: when the symbols appropriately represent some aspect of the real world and the information processing leads to a successful solution of the problem given to the system. Note, this top-down architecture is susceptible to catastrophic system failure, whether a mainframe computer or a pyramidal social or political institution. And here, referring to Edwin Hutchins' work, first with Micronesian sailors, distinguishing between the top-down computation of navigational cognition of the US Navy versus Micronesian sailors sailing out of sight of land for thousands of miles and being able to know where they are based on both embodied cognition of the shaman navigator as well as the lore of the distributed cognition of the culture. This is a pretty good description. Edwin Hutchins did a further up study, which was the basis of his MacArthur Genius Grant, where an American, a U.S. Navy ship, which was a helicopter carrier, enters San Diego Harbor and experiences massive systems failure, where the electronical systems, including all the computers, go down. And I don't know whether this was done deliberately for the purposes of this experiment, because he had a video team that was following around the navigational team all over the ship. And what he did is he gathered data of how the navigational team responded to the condition of massive systems failure. And what he noticed was the emergence of a form of navigational cognition hearkening hundreds of years previous in terms of the history of navigational cognition, with tools that they just happened to have on board more for nostalgia's sake. And they basically recreate, the form of taking sightings alongside of land and using knotted ropes to determine the depth of the channel from the open ocean into San Diego Harbor. And we're able to form a form of navigational cognition, which prevented the ship from going aground because, as Edwin Hutchins cites, careers as well as lives were at stake. So Edwin Hutchins demonstrates this in terms of showing, one, how the Navy was so vulnerable to massive systems failure, which became implicated not in terms of Navy culture, which remained the same, but in terms of the computational architecture of the ship, and then they turned the ships into distributed cognitive assemblages of network computers, which meant that if any one computer got hit by an exocet missile it would not take out the entire system. So massive redundancy solved the problem. But of course, one of the implications of the book is that it didn't solve the problem of possible massive systems failure for the culture itself. Now, the emergent properties paradigm of cognitive science. What is cognition? The emergence of global states in a network of simple components. Question 2, how does it work? Through local rules for individual operation and rules for changes in the connectivity among the elements. Question 3, how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? When the emergent properties and resulting structures can be seen to correspond to a specific cognitive capacity, a successful solution to required task, also from the embodied mind. One might argue that both paradigms are embodied in human cognitive architecture, with the top-down paradigm especially dominant in Western European culture. So let's return to Francisco Varela's The Specious Present. So he points out that there's an irreducible time lag between the reception of sensation, oral sensation, for example, and its registering with self-conscious awareness, which we can associate with executive function. In other words, what Libet refers to the half second, which is more like 1/64th of a second. And this corresponds to what Paul Thompson says when he says, I have to get my mind out of the way. This is an example of a time lag that results from filtering sensory experience through top-down executive function. So what Varela says is that there are 3 scales of temporality for cognitive events that are engaged with an imminent temporal horizon. The basic elementary neuronal events at the 1/10 scale, relaxation for large-scale integration, which is the 1 scale, and descriptive narrative assessments, such as the 10 scale. And here I'd just like to anticipate by saying Levitin reports of the significance of hardwire from the cochlea to the motor regions of the brain, which bypass the prefrontal and frontal regions associated with executive function and associated with startle or flight or fight instinctive responses, which in turn bypass that half-second lag and which enable immediate reactive response to oral stimulation. So let's go into a little more detail from the species present, which is in a collection called, now I'm looking for it, Neurophenomenology, which came out of the Stanford Writing Science series, edited by Varela, Petitot, and a number of other people. And the essay, The Species Present, is in there, but I think it should be also available as a PDF. I'm not sure whether I had provided a link to that among the, a link to that essay in the materials that I gave to you folks. So let me just run through these quickly. So this is some details. So I'm not going to spend too much time explaining you. I've given you an overall arching explanation of what they mean. The first 1/10 scale involves cognition of a fusion interval that enables the minimum distance needed for 2 stimuli to be perceived as non-simultaneous. These are anchored in chemical, cellular, and neurological discharge rhythms. Here we're talking about, quote, microcognitive phenomena involving perceptual moments, central isolations, iconic memory, excitability cycles, and subjective time quanta. This corresponds to the direct input from the senses, analogous to Arakawa and Gin's perceptual landing site and with Kahneman's fast thinking. The second scale, which Varela refers to long-range integration, while microcognitive component processes have short durational life, this second scale involves the level of a fully constituted normal cognitive operation. So such cognitive acts as perception, action, memory, motivation, and so forth can be discussed in terms of cell assemblies, or more precisely, neuronal assemblies, which are both distributed and capable of strong reciprocal connections. The emphasis is on long-range integration of cognitive processes emanating from the 1/10 and 10th scales. The emergence of neuronal assemblies indicates the capacity to act creatively. This corresponds to Arakawa and Ginz's dimensionalizing landing site. The third scale involves experience of immediate daily coping, which manifests at the perception action level, having a duration on the order of seconds. We have musicians performing contingently while maintaining awareness of the sustained template of the song, a lead sheet that serves as Daniel Dennett's narrative center of gravity, and the reference to that is below, and Kahneman's concept of slow thinking, which is analogous to Arakawa and Ginz's imaging landing site. So Lim and Brown's landmark study, Neurosubstrates of Spontaneous Music Performance, an fMRI study of jazz improvisation from 2018, concludes the following. When executive function in the visual cortex falls asleep, the neuronal ensembles emerge, and the LIMS team proposed that the emergence of neuronal ensembles may have something to do with creativity writ large. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that jazz musicians know how to tap into their creative processes in a way the rest of us should want to know. On the bandstand, they can dismantle top-down forms of cognition associated with executive function and also involving slow cognition. And here's a picture from the Lemon-Brown essay of neuronal ensembles emerging spontaneously during jazz improvisation. But the question comes, in red light, those are highlighted because they represent areas where there's massive oxygen consumption, indicating that those are active areas of the brain, whereas the blue areas are associated with top-down cognition and are relatively asleep with respect to oxygen consumption. So the question emerges, can more than one neuronal ensemble coexist, and do they interfere or amplify each other? So the title of the slide of this particular picture is three-dimensional surface projections of activations and deactivations associated with improvisation during the jazz paradigm. So now we can go to Francisco Varela's three hypotheses on neuronal ensembles, which comes from the essay, The Specious Present. Hypothesis 1. For every cognitive act, there's a singular specific cell assembly that underlies its emergence and operation. Hypothesis 2. A specific cell assembly is selected through fast transient phase locking and belonging to activated neurons activated neurons belonging to subthreshold competing cell assemblies. Hypothesis 3. The integration relaxation processes at the one scale are strict correlates of present time consciousness. Now I'm going to suggest that one of Varela's longtime collaborators and who has built a remarkable career as a philosopher of mind since Varela's passing in 2001. Here's his extension. In his most recent work, Waking, Dreaming, and Being, Thompson poses a model of mind as containing distinct global phases, such as waking and dreaming, which float over a default background awareness, which he calls being. I argue that there are microphases within waking, for example, that account for the relative predominance not only of distinct forms of time cognition, 1/10, 10th, and 1 scales, but also could account for microphases associated with specific behavior, global behaviors, such as what I call projective apprehension and propriosentience, and competing phases suggesting an analog with information associated with a distinction between coherence and noise, whereas these distinct forms of time cognition actually interfere with each other, as well as possibly amplifying in what might be called within jazz a peak experience of performance. So, embodied to distributed cognition and the sonic field, a few more recent studies. So, one study points out that there are differences in brain behavior between music and language as forms of communication, which meant that jazz shares with language areas associated with syntax, which is largely a bottom-up cognitive property, a behavior, as opposed to semantics, which is a top-down and slow form of cognition. So music and language share syntax as areas associated with areas of the brain, but not semantics. Study 2, synchronized brain function in achieving meaning between two speakers. In other words, there's coordination between communicators, and that suggests a correlation between meaning achieved between speakers. In other words, there's synchronized brain activity in achieving meaning between two speakers as measured through fMRI, EEGs, and so forth. Study 3, 2 guitarists and synchronized brain function. Here we're talking about jazz, I mean classical music instead of jazz, but I think it certainly is something that would apply to both. Intra and interbrain synchronization and network properties when playing jazz and duets. Here, Sanger, Muller, and Lindenberger noticed that 2 guitarists who knew each other really well, who had performed together frequently, and who were rehearsing a classical guitar classical duet, a guitar duet that they both knew intimately, they found that when they wired them up, their brains synchronized before even a note had been played. So this raises the question, how can we move from embodied cognition to distributed cognition? And how do we talk about the human agency, the non-human agency of instruments in the context of distributed cognition? So here I talk about, as a title of a section in the chapter that I had you folks read, can a jazz musician's ear talk to the hands like the frog's eye talk to the tongue? So Maturano, with a bunch of other people associated with second order cybernetics, did a study of brain behavior of a frog as it was about to take a fly. And what they noticed is that there was coordination and synchrony between the brain behavior of the tongue and the movement of the eyes, while there was absolutely nothing at all being registered in the brain itself, in other parts of the brain. So that's why I called this section, Can the Jazz Musician's Ear Talk to the Hands Like the Frog's Eye Talk to the Tongue? And this was a landmark study, not only for second order cybernetics, but the role of emergence in cognition, generally speaking. So it's a landmark study which began, in a sense, the research project that Maturano began with Varela on autopoiesis and cognition. So let's talk about the implications of Lim and Brown's study in terms of cognitive architecture, in terms of executive function in the visual cortex. So we associated predominantly top-down in terms of classical pianists, predominantly bottom-up in terms of jazz pianists, and the notion that there's an emergence of neuronal ensemble behavior with respect to creativity writ large, particularly visible among the jazz musicians. But now we can talk about three forms of cognition that are capable of interfering with each other. The universal phenomenon of jazz musicians getting lost. And here I actually interviewed Dave Liebman over the phone, 2010. And he talks about getting lost. And he says every jazz musician gets lost. And what he says is that the difference between novice musicians like myself and him is that he can recognize and return to where he is in the song within a bar, within 4 beats or 3 beats, however the song may be. Which means that all jazz musicians, that the relationship between the 10 scale, which maintains the narrative frame in the song, and the 1 scale, which enables visceral interaction beneath the threshold of cognitive awareness, within of conscious awareness with the other musicians, they can overshadow each other. But an experienced musician can maintain the stability between the 1/10 scale and the 10 scale much better than a novice musician. And so he can find himself back to the song form within a bar. Now let's talk about bottom-up cognition and the 1/10 scale. Daniel Levitin and Steven Pinker have a conversation that Levitin talks about in This Is Your Brain on Music. He talks about flight or fight and startle reflexes. He talks about the fact they talked about the fact that there are a few hardwires from the cochlea that don't go to the area of sound cognition that is associated with top-down cognition and executive function, which involve that half-second delay. That there are hardwires which go directly from the cochlea to the cerebellum and the areas of the motor reflexes, where proprioception takes place, which enables theoretically to bypass that half second delay. So there could be instantaneous response to what's being heard. And in flight or fight and startle reflexes, those startle reflexes also enable head movement so that the head moves immediately to the source of sound, which caused the startle, in order to orient itself in terms of the potential threat. But here we're not talking about threat, we're talking about pleasing experience, not threatening experience. But this can be misconstrued. And so I would like to point to two examples where this gets misconstrued. Charlie Mingus, the famous bassist, performer, and composer, had really a rather vicious reputation where he would sometimes really threaten his bandmates before they would go on stage, literally immediately before going on stage, sometimes pulling out a knife and threatening them. And there's no reason really why he would do this, unless he thought in some way that generating that kind of visceral reaction at an instinctual level would enable his players to play better. I mean, that's an interpretation on my part. But one could also remember what many people consider as an awful movie called Whiplash, where the conductor of the jazz musicians really engages in brutal behavior towards his students. And one can suggest that this movie is kind of an allegory, and here I'm providing my own editorial comments, that this is really an allegory of white European colonization of the cognitive processes of jazz. And that the narrative is really driven by this allegory. And I won't push that too far, but I think it's suggestive of a way of reading that that film, which recuperates it somewhat, at least, I think, in terms of what it accomplishes. And I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer section. But it's basically, I'm just trying to describe not only the aesthetic but the political implications of this cognitive architecture as I'm describing jazz and cognition. So we're talking about feedback loops, which, if you remember, is one of the aspects necessary for emergent systems to behave. We're talking about emergent feedback loops between the motor regions and the cochlea, between motor regions and spatial memory, between language and spatial memory, between emotional centers and motor regions, and so forth and so on. So we also have evidence of neuroplasticity, that the flight or fight and startle reflexes are in effect, and there's been some empirical evidence that those hardwires grow in jazz musicians, that they develop, that there is neuroplasticity in the development of these vestigial elements of human beings in the wild, if you might say. And so the neuroplasticity means that it involves a neuroadaptation of instinctual pathways for aesthetic purposes. But now we can talk about not only feedback loops within the individual, and I would suggest that the 1 scale and the 10 scale are also engaged in a feedback for dominance over the 1 scale of cognition. And then we can talk about jazz and ethical expertise. So here's a model, and here I'm just going to end here because I think I've gone on long enough. Here is the map early on from 1979's Francisco Varela's Principles of Biological Autonomy, after he had distanced himself from Maturana, where we have systems and subsystems. And what I'm suggesting is that these apply not only within the individual brain of the individual embodied cognitive improviser, the embodied cognitive processes of the individual improviser, But one could then apply that individual embodied improvisers are also part of a subsystems which unite in terms of an entire global system which compromises the jazz ensemble itself. And I would just say that I'm still thinking through what is the role of the non-human agency of instruments in enabling this movement from embodied cognition to distributed cognition to occur. And on that point, why don't I stop and end? So I've stopped the screen sharing, and I'll open it up to questions. Take a sip. And any questions? Shreya?
Hi. I have my question was, I know you've mentioned that there are forms of embodied cognition, and I was trying to understand why you're using the term cognition. I understand maybe like the neurological metaphors as well, but why is it not just a communication system?
One, that's a question beyond my pay grade. And two, given the intimate connection between second order cybernetics and the emergence of cognitive science, historically, I don't have any problem with what you're proposing. But
Okay.
But we're really dealing with different domains. So cognitive science deals with humans and with computers and with human-computer interfaces and that sort of thing. Communication deals with, it does deal with that to a certain extent, but it also deals with telecommunication systems and the internet and speech communication, classical rhetoric and, and so forth and so on. So, beyond that, I don't know if I have that much to offer. I mean, it'd be a wonderful, maybe we should come back to it because it's a wonderful segue to a whole, seminar to discuss. But it's a great question, and certainly, one that I feel overwhelmed by at this particular moment. Marika? David.
Yeah, hey. Hi. Yeah, thanks for this incredibly rich talk, Martin. I just feel I need to chase up some of these sources. I just feel kind of underread. But
you and me both.
But really, it's incredibly rich and thought-provoking. So thank you so much for sharing this. I haven't. I've just got a few thoughts which might kind of resolve into a question. I mean, I'm interested in the distinction between bottom up and top down as you make it, because there were times when I thought that you were referring to some kind of neural architecture, that is, relationships literally between parts of the nervous system, the central nervous system, and in a sense how they interact. And there were times when it seemed to refer to a more kind of functional or cognitive distinction between, say, some kind of symbolic process, essentially some kind of symbol crunching or symbolic transformations, for example, computational transformations of symbols, as opposed to some kind of microcognitive level, which perhaps is pre-symbolic or non-symbolic. And I'm wondering if you could say, I mean, the reason why that was interesting me is that, so for example, in the way that I don't know Varela's work that well, which is probably a bit of an admission in this kind of company, but I read the odd essay, but so for example, there were times when bottom up seemed to be referring to proximity to the kind of sensory periphery, some kind of input from the environment, as opposed to some kind of higher level processing of that input. And that's interesting in the context of some contemporary models of mind which emphasize, even at the kind of sensory level, anticipatory or modeling processes, where there's, so I'm thinking particularly about predictive processing models, where the role of the sensory input is very much is not so much to create representations as to modulate or correct errors in anticipatory simulations or models, so that when you're seeing a house as opposed to I don't know, a tree, you're activating a certain kind of anticipatory representation of a house and its various facets and properties, a bit like Husserl describes when he describes the sort of time consciousness of anticipating an object's aspects. And the role of the sensory input there is to kind of modulate or correct that model, so that, for example, if the house turns out to be a flat set in a film set, you correct appropriately, and you provide another another model is substituted, which better copes with that sort of flurry of sensory information. So I guess there are arguments to the effect that actually both the kind of lower level sensory processing and the higher level executive function could involve, if you like, recurrent processes which are not sort of rather than top down as opposed to bottom up,
right?
So I guess there are a range of different ways you could interpret the top-down, bottom-up relationship. One of them is, if you like, in terms of the supervenience of all cognition upon local interactions, and the other is in terms of the architecture of the brain, and the other is in terms of more functional terms, in terms of different types of cognitive function and their relationship to one another, and and I'm interested in kind of teasing them apart here.
I don't think it would be useful to, for example, do a top lobotomy and then see if it's possible to play classical music, and then a bottom lobotomy in order to be able to play jazz, to see if
there might be ethical considerations as well.
Yeah, try to get through that. The ethics panel at the local university for funding. Yeah, but there is, some neuroarchitecture to this, because when we're dealing with proprioception, in addition to, the endpoint of the feedback loop of startle and flight or fight reflexes. I mean, that's the oldest part of the brain. That's what is colloquially referred to as the reptilian brain. But otherwise, I think it's more functional than geographical. And so I'd really be interested in seeing what you think of Varela's work. I don't know how much you've read by him and those associated with him, but two books that have really influenced me is The Embodied Mind and Cognition in the Wild, Cognition in the Wild being Hutchins' book. And I just found it really interesting to look not only in terms of the aesthetic implications of this top-down and bottom-up architecture, but also its cultural and political implications. And so I can see, for example, that there must be neuronal ensemble behavior for classical musicians in some way. But notice that it's got nothing to do with symbolic manipulation, because that trajectory is already established for the classical musician. But, touch and feeling and emotion and all of those being involved, maybe there are other forms of neuronal ensembles that emerge.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I'm really out of my depth, as you could probably tell from my discussion of the extended mind.
Well, this is a very brief point about the extended mind, because I'm entirely with your, I'm entirely with your kind of analysis in terms of the extended self, the self as multiplicity. Certainly within the sort of, I've got half a sort of awe in the kind of, I guess, more analytic tradition of philosophy of mind. I haven't done much in relation to it recently, but certainly in the original Chalmers and Clark essay on the extended mind, which sort of set the ball rolling, at least within the sort of Anglo-American tradition, I guess. One key idea that they enunciate, which I think is potentially useful and malleable, is the idea of the parity principle. So the basic idea is that what's important about any process, any cognitive process, is the contribution it makes to the system, the cognitive contribution it makes to the system, not where it's located. So, for example, if you're doing long division in your head, if you're wired up to be able to do that, that's great. You do some kind of internal sort of imaging, perhaps of numerals, or your working memory is good enough to keep the results in mind and then spit out the result at the end. That's great. But if you do it on paper with pen and paper, in a sense, substituting the paper for your working, the pen and paper for your working memory, and spit out the result, that's essentially the same process cognitively. What matters is because it makes the same contribution, so that what matters is not where something is with vis-a-vis the skin bag, but what it does functionally for the system. And that's it's kind of a. I think initially that was a sort of an interesting analytic consequence of functionalism. That functionalism is in philosophy of mind is the idea that you characterize cognitive states or mental states in terms of what they do and their relationship to other mental states and their contribution to the, if you like, the economy of the mind. not in terms of their intrinsic material properties, but in terms of, you know, those relationships. So once you buy into that, then it doesn't really matter whether those states are made out of neuronal firings or made out of marks on a paper, if they, in a sense, achieve the same result. You know, and similarly, you can offload your you know, if you offload your memory, your memory onto your phone or your writing pad, you know, you are literally outsourcing your mental states to the environment, and that's, I guess, implicit in what Hutchins is doing, as I understand it. I mean, he's widely quoted in you know, so the parity principle is quite useful, and I think if you generalize it, it kind of makes sense, perhaps, of the idea that that a lot of these processes of you know, bottom-up organization could just as well be taking place in a group of musicians interacting together as within a single brain, and that's brought out by your example of, I guess, of the two guitar players who are sort of at some level resonating. And I think I've read studies of, for example, pianists playing duets, which also or improvising together, which also shows that there are, you know, important correlations between their, you know, neuronal activity, you know, over time. So yeah, I think that I'm just throwing that in there, really, as, you know, potentially useful.
Well, I'm going to check
very basic.
I'm going to check out the parity principle, because it also seems to be a principle of feedback, wouldn't you say?
It could be. I mean, I think as I said, I think it comes essentially from a kind of functionalist conception of a mental process as what, in terms of what it does, or a mental state in terms of its role within a process. But yeah, I think if you then characterize mental processes in terms of feedback, then it doesn't matter where those feedback loops are happening, whether they're inside the brain or outside the brain, if they're, in a sense, contributing to the same result. I think that's how you could extend the parity principle to this more. I think a lot of what you're doing, in a sense, is more to do with the embedded mind, as much to do with the embedded mind as the extended mind, but you could play around with the parity principle, perhaps,
I mean, I tend to come out of a 4Es perspective. But I was, in a sense, paying tribute to the analytic tradition by talking about the extended mind.
Yeah, and of course there's an idea that comes out of that called process externalism, whereby that a process, a cognitive process, can be, if you like, both within and without the mind. You know, it could depend on stuff going on both within the body and outside, you know, which links in nicely to this idea of sort of coupling of internal and external states within a single kind of overarching process. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to dip into Chalmers and those other guys to talk about parity, the parity principle and process externalization.
Yeah, it might be, well, process externalism, it might be relevant, but I'm just throwing it in there as potentially kind of worth looking at.
Oh, it's always good to have. It's always good to have your much more grounded perspective on these things. So
I'm hand waving myself. Anyway, I'll
Renzo, Renzo, did you want to ask a question?
Thank you very much, Martin. Well, my question is related. In some sense, I understand your point. Trying to differentiate between informational aspects and intuitive aspects, but I started thinking about Stigler in the sense. Stigler, when he mentioned the historical a priori, that is the retentional aspects, certain retentional aspects of informations, that is part of human conditions in our evolutions with the externalization of instruments. So my question is, if we are part of this informational aspect that Stigler taken from Derrida, that is the grammar of the supplement that we have inherent in our condition as a human beings, no? It's part of our co-constitutions with these externalizations. How we can understand, because it was one of the words from Stigler, is the negantropic aspect, no? The negantropic aspect of how we use these externalizations, these informational aspects in our own systems and in the whole systems, of course, that we constitute in this intermediation between mediums. So how you can see, talking about in cybernetic aspects, how you can observe these negantropic aspects using in these two aspects of informational and intuitional aspects, prediction and intuition, in this balance that we don't have in that moment as a society with this entropic information that we are living nowadays, because you're putting examples of jazz's musicians from 50s, 60s, before computer or social media networks, all this. Nowadays, with these new technologies, with artificial intelligence and all these new tools that we have for making arts, music, etc., you can see this negantropic aspect in this co-constitution with this mediations condition for building this improvisations aspect in a political sense, of course. Because for me, it's a political aspect to have these improvisations in this all these calculability system that we live nowadays. So this is my question for you, Martin, and thank you very much for your exposition.
Thanks for a great question, Renzo. Next week, in addition to presentations from the members of the seminar, I'm also hoping to talk about the essay, The Gift of Silence, Towards an Anthropology of Jazz Improvisation as Neuroresistance. And I think that might be a place where we can raise these kinds of issues. But I would want to emphasize that when you're talking about negentropy, which is thermodynamic processes exhibiting self-organizing behavior, that there was a strong connection between that work, who for me, the work of Prigogine exemplifies, second order cybernetics and cognitive science. And Varela and Maturana were looking to non-equilibrium thermodynamics as an analogy. Even to the point of understanding the importance of phase space, and Varela actually describing cognitive behavior in thermodynamic terms. And I'm trying to remember the specific term. Brownian, he wanted to apply Brownian science to cognition. I mean, that's his exact quote. And what was also really interesting is Varela talks about emergent behaviors in cognitive science with reference to jazz in one or two places, which is kind of cool for my purposes, but that's, you know, but the whole notion of neuroresistance and thinking about jazz as a form of neuroresistance directly addresses what you're talking about. So I'd be interested to see what you think of that essay. And maybe we can talk about it next week if you have time to make it. I'd be really thrilled. Great question, by the way. Akshat, do you have a question?
Yeah. Am
You
I
want
audible?
yeah, but why don't you turn on your video?
Right. Hello.
Yes, I can see you. Are you there? Your screen froze for some reason. Hello? I think we've lost Akshat. Hello? Anyone else?
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. Trying to turn on my video literally
Yeah.
crashed my
Well,
system.
then just ask your
So
question. Yeah, don't worry
yeah.
about it.
So my question was also following on Marika's point about the top-down and bottom-up distinction that you've made between classical music and jazz music. And I think my major concern here was, is it really wise to make that distinction based upon, like, let's say, a particular genre of music, considering the evolution of classical music in the last 100 years, like things like John Cage and like present day compositions, and perhaps it would be better to look at certain bottom up ways of approaching classical music and certain top down ways of approaching jazz, like the example of latter being Whiplash, where I think the film, or Fletcher's character particularly, has a top down approach to jazz standards. And as an aside, could you perhaps comment on the phenomenological topology of a jazz musician going places?
But I'm having a hard time grasping the question.
So the question is essentially, should this distinction between top down and bottom up cognition be applied to like genres, or should it be applied to modalities of
That's
approaching genres?
yeah. I think that's a really really good question. There's a certain extent where my approach is schematic, and it arises out of my talk last week, where I showed the differences in really the cognition of time between classical and jazz music. And while I would suggest that classical musicians, because they're caught up in a deterministic model of time, have a predisposition toward top-down cognitive processes versus jazz musicians. Now, I don't mean that to be absolute, and I certainly don't mean there are, like there are in Pittsburgh, really wonderful musicians who live in both worlds. There's a guy named Jeff Grubbs who's a classical bassist and plays with the symphony, Pittsburgh Symphony, one of the best symphonies in the world. And he's also a tremendous jazz bassist. And he can go from one world to the next. But he notices a really big difference in the frame of his awareness when he's doing one point of music versus the other. And there is some evidence that seems to reinforce this perspective that comes out of the work of the team led by Charles Limb at Johns Hopkins in particular. So I think that that's as far as I can go with an answer. but I think, for example, that top-down and bottom-up forms of cognition occur in each individual, and three forms of time cognition occur simultaneously in each individual. But it's really the style of that individual's functioning that determines what predominates. And
Right.
I think if you're a jazz musician, it's going to predominate because it requires you to dismantle executive function in order for jazz expression to emerge spontaneously. So maybe the problem is just with the orientational metaphors of top and down. But there is a difference. There's a difference theoretically in the way that cognitive scientists have explored forms of both human and non-human cognition. And there are differences in the empirical evidence in terms of genres of music.
And to the second part of the question, could you speak to the phenomenological topology of a jazz musician going places while they're playing?
Going places? I'm not
Right.
sure.
So when a jazz musician really starts improvising, it's a typical phrase that is used to indicate their lostness is he's going places. So what do you feel about that? And like,
Well,
uh,
I was actually trying to talk about that. I would not call that getting lost because they're still in tune with the other instruments when they're playing with them. You know, like a sitar and a tabla, for example. They may go wild and woolly in terms of the improvisation, but they're still grounded in an embodied way with the percussive rhythm. And one could argue, as I do in the next essay, that percussive rhythm is most important of all. So maybe I'm not understanding the question, but I would think that the whole talk was really about the phenomenology, the neurophenomenology of jazz improvisation. So it's hard for me to respond to a question about the phenomenology of jazz without just repeating my whole talk, which went on far too long in the first place. But I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, so I actually do agree with you, which is why I feel going places is a much better sort of metaphor for that than lostness.
Yeah, I'm not sure that when I was talking about getting lost, it really represented a kind of cognitive dysfunction where the two forms of time cognition are interfering with each other. And this happens a lot for novice players, but it also can happen with very experienced players where they just go off the reservation in terms of the song form, of the narrative template of their performance in symbolic form. And the rest of the ensemble just has to scramble after him trying to connect in some way.
I think my favorite examples of those are when the other musicians stop even trying to connect and maybe just step off and let them have a solo or maybe even go off stage for some
Yeah.
extended bits.
Right. So that would be, in a sense, a positive version of going off the reservation, as opposed to the negative version of getting lost, where there's actually cacophony occurring because somebody doesn't know what they should be doing at that particular moment.
Right.
So I agree with that. So Tam Hare, am I pronouncing your name right?
You are? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a question here, but I'm just kind of thinking about what's been said previously, and thinking about your examples, specifically jazz, but obviously mentioning not to get bogged down too much in genres. I suppose my question's about the whole idea of almost trying to negate the genre in some sense, which of course becomes a problem in itself. But if you think of the sort of slightly paradoxical idea of like non-idiomatic music, which in itself has become an idiom, which seems a bit strange, but at least the kind of principles around such practices and other kind of avant-garde musical disciplines, and just how music, although cognition is clearly the area that you've given most attention to, but how music is also kind of, let's say, to use your phrase, it's bodied, in more ways than simply cognitively. Whether perhaps some would argue that it maybe starts there at least, but if you think of kind of music and minimalist practices and practices around repetition and drone and things like that, and whether or not this kind of study, not saying this is for you necessarily, but for something that interests me and probably others, whether or not this study could be kind of extended to musical forms that are not so kind of let's say, for good and bad, have like a lot of baggage, and a lot of history, like of course jazz and classical music clearly do. But and what kind of study, what kind of results could studies show when if they were applied to musical forms that are far less, that are more, for want of a better phrase right now, more kind of intuitive in that sense, and don't have, try and I suppose as much as possible wriggle away from some of these more idiomatic musical forms.
I guess one of the points of the talk last week is that I was trying to get across a notion that jazz was not a genre, that it was actually a style of cognitive functioning that could be applied to any genre of music. And I was trying to explain this week why it is so special. And so,
sorry, can I just clarify then? Would you suggest then that almost anything that isn't already readily genred in that sense becomes jazz? Is that what you're suggesting?
well,
Unless it just obviously is jazz, I don't know.
Well, basically what I was trying to demonstrate is that jazz is a form of cognitive rocket science. That there's something that jazz musicians know, embody, that the rest of us need to understand. And part of that is the ability to dismantle top-down cognitive processes in order to allow spontaneous, contingent, creative activity to occur. And they know this in incredibly nuanced and subtle ways. A jazz musician gets on the bandstand and they literally dismantle, hundreds of thousands of years of neuroevolution in order to be able to respond, no matter how complex the symbolic language of the music is, off the top of their heads, to use a bad metaphor. That's what I'm trying to describe. And I don't think it has anything to do with genre. It has to do with the kind of training that jazz musicians go through, which is very different from really any other kind of music, with some profound exceptions, where improvisation is central to the cultural manifestations of the music, like Indian classical music, for example, or even bluegrass. The thing is being able to dismantle not only top-down architecture, but intentionality, so that a collective intelligence emerges amongst the ensemble. And I'm also suggesting that the neuronal ensembles, which are visible in the empirical research on jazz musicians, could be applied to the jazz ensemble itself at scale. Was that helpful?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it gave me a little more perspective on it. I guess that the kind of the examples that you were using are very kind of let's say kind of comparative in some ways. They're kind of there's there seems to be certain stylistic and kind of historical traits that link a lot of these musicians in some way, like as you obviously rightly suggested with your presentation, the kind of mapping going through of about the linkage between them. And I guess if you put certainly for someone who's not totally spends a huge amount of time listening to jazz, probably in the way that you do, there is a kind of there would be kind of certain similarities, I would assume, with the kind of performance and the idiosyncrasies and the kind of different stylistic musical sounds that you would hear. So I just wondered if you could, whatever like genre in itself is problematic. I totally understand that, but if a kind of a very different, let's just say in naive terms, very different sounding kind of music and kind of bodily kind of embodied music, which in a very different way. What kind of results might that
if you could come next week and provide me with a list of things to listen to, I think that might be a real help, because I'm not sure what you're talking about in terms of specific examples.
Well, I was thinking, I mean, things that sprung to mind. Musicians like David Toop, but who's also done quite a lot of research and is a kind of musicologist as well as a musician himself. He's just one name that springs to mind, and then there's other more kind of well-known jazz performers, but tried to have a very kind of specific practice, like AMM and a British jazz ensemble, and kind of some noise artists like I'm blanking about To Live and Shave in LA, and groups like they're little, I suppose might be seen as a little dated now, but they try to apply a very specific kind of let's say they try to kind of, as it's been I suppose attributed to it later on, this kind of this notion of a kind of non-idiomatic music. So that kind of, in a sense, tries to not be easily appropriated into any particular kind of pigeonhole or however you want to describe it. But I could send you, yeah, I could, of course.
Yeah, that would be really
more
helpful.
Research and give you some
Because
better examples.
I mean, in this context, I'm just confronted by my own lack of knowledge. So
No, not at all. I just, it was more like a speculative kind of.
well, no, I'm open to learning new stuff, and you know, like the first British musician you mentioned, I don't know. I don't know his work at all. The one who's a musicologist as well as a performer. I didn't get
Yeah,
that.
David Toop. Yeah, he's quite an interesting.
David
Toop with a T-double-O-P.
David Toop.
Yeah, like top, but with two O's. So it's Toop.
Okay, David Toop. I'll look him up. Thank you.
No problem.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Cool.
Anyone else? Or Shreya, do you want to add something new?
I was wondering actually about, I read this book a really long time ago by Oliver Sacks called Musicophilia.
Yes.
And I was wondering if in that, if you were aware of, if there were any examples about jazz and neuroresistance or any kind of like case studies where music has demonstrated some of the things that you've mentioned in your talk and in your essay?
I didn't, I have it right in front of me, but I didn't use it in particular. But if you know Oliver Sacks is a medical doctor and a scientist, researcher, you know, lots of case studies in there.
Yeah.
So, but nothing specifically on jazz and resistance, not that I'm aware of. Anyone else?